And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Merriweather, who will moderate the panel discussion that will kick us off today. Michelle has dedicated her career to advocating for African Americans and underserved communities. She joined the Urban League of Metro Seattle in 2015 as the vice president and became the 13th president of the organization in 2018. Prior to that, Michelle was based in her hometown of Los Angeles and served in various roles with the Los Angeles Urban League, Starbucks, Heinz, and Coca-Cola, among others. Michelle is a graduate of Xavier University and serves on many, many community boards, and clearly is one of our leaders in the region. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Carla. Hi, Carl. Good to see you. It is an honor to be here, and thank you to Case and the HGC and all of those that are helping us frame this important conversation today. I'm honored to serve as the moderator as we discuss how we're going to, the how of our challenge statement and come up with brilliant ideas that I know many of us, especially the three fantastic, brilliant panelists that we have today to come to solutions of those that are most impacted. And as we support all of our underserved and marginalized groups, in particular, our Black community. Because as we know, if we solve for those that are most marginalized, we will all win. So with that, I'm going to introduce our fantastic panelists today by reading the abbreviated version of their fantastic bios. So I hope that in reading these bios, I do them justice, but for sake of time, it's the abbreviated version. So our first panelist is Darryl Smith, Executive Director of HomeSight. Darryl has built a long history of experience in the arenas of real estate brokerage, neighborhood revitalization, municipal government, workforce development for young adults, and place-based community development. He has held a variety of civic roles, including the presidency of Rainier Valley Chamber, member of the board of Seattle Planning Commission, and an appointed member of the Mayor's Economic Task Force. In 2009, Darryl was appointed to Deputy Mayor of the City of Seattle, where he served for 4 years, overseeing the Departments of Neighborhood, Civil Rights, Housing, Human Services, and Economic Development for Mayor Mike McGinn. Darryl has been an active participant in the lifeblood of Southeast Seattle for over 25 years, most notable as the chair of Columbia City Revitalization in the early 90s, and as the originator of the celebrated monthly music event, Beat Walk. Glad to have you, Darryl. Donald King, Donald I. King, FAIA, is an architect, planner, and educator with over 50 years of professional experience in the practice areas of architectural design, community planning, and project management. He has specialized expertise in urban design and planning, design of community-based projects, healthcare facilities, educational facilities, affordable family housing, and special needs housing. He is currently the CEO and president of Nehemiah Initiative Seattle, principal architect of Mimar Studio, and an affiliate professor of architecture at the University of Washington's College of Built Environments. Honored to have you, Mr. King. And Nicole Bascomb-Green is the owner, designated broker of Bascomb Real Estate Group, where her work focuses on educating the community on buying and selling of residential real estate with a focus on the Black community. Nicole has worked in banking and financial services industry for over 25 years. Nicole is a native of Seattle, Washington, and is an alumnus of the Garfield High School. She received her undergraduate degree in marketing from the University of Washington and her MBA with a focus on community development from the University of Phoenix. Nicole is also a graduate of Leadership Tomorrow class of 2017. As a native, Nicole's work, both on the personal and professional level, has focused on the financial health and wellness of the Black community, particularly in housing. In addition, she serves on the executive board of the National Black MBA Association Seattle chapter as vice president of programming, and as a board member, one of my bosses for the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle, is the president of the National Association for Real Estate Brokers Seattle chapter, and as a member of the wonderful, fantastic, beautiful sorority of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. No bias there. Yes, there is. Nicole is married to Michael Green and has 3 beautiful daughters, Nehemiah, Sonia, and Samira, with 2 of the 3 girls currently in college. Wonderful to have you, my soror and friend. So with that, I'm going to start with the first question and really just wanting to know more. I know we shared your bio, but there's so much more to what brought you here today. And so can you all just share what brings you and your full self to this work? And Darryl, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And it's just so wonderful. And I'm so honored to be here with these amazing panelists. And I'm really motivated to be here as well. And this is a real personal journey for me. And my time here with HomeSight is somewhat brief in sort of the history of the work, if you will. But it's an amazing organization that I'm just blessed to be leading at this point, in this moment in the country's history, as HomeSight was formed 31 years ago, really in the Central District to address redlining in appraisals and in mortgage lending. We are a builder, we're a community development corporation, place-based, and a really creative mortgage lender focusing on building generational wealth for people of color. And we are very, very motivated to get after this issue based on our history, and being a part of this, being so personal for me, which I'm happy to share a little bit about in a moment or so. Really is focusing for me. So this is important, and that's what brings me here.
Thank you, Darryl. Nicole, how about you?
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to my co-panelists. I am humbled also to be on this panel and have this discussion and be able to participate in this event. So I look forward to the work that we do moving forward. So what brought me here is, I currently serve in multiple roles. You named 2, but I'm also the vice president of Community Affairs for U.S. Bank, and I cover Washington and Idaho. And so in my roles, I really have the pleasure to be able to marry my work to be very supportive in the community in a broader way. So in that role, for my brokerage, my dad started our brokerage as a family business, and he passed on a legacy to me and my sisters that we don't see very much in the Black community. So being able to continue to facilitate the legacy of my father's business is one of the most important things that I do, to provide support to the community and my family as well. And in my role, I'm the incoming president of the Western Washington Realty Seattle chapter of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. And a little history on the National Association of Real Estate Brokers: it was founded in Tampa, Florida in 1947 as an equal opportunity and civil rights organization for African-American real estate professionals, consumers, and communities in America. As many of us know, and we're on this call because we know the history, Black professionals could not be a part of the other real estate trade organizations in the country. There were multiple Black trade organizations, and they decided to come together in Tampa in 47 and provide one large, strong organization to support democracy and housing. And that's what we do on a national scale, and also the work that we do here locally. And so I have always been drawn to housing and the importance of it. Obviously, my father was a real estate broker for 45 years at the time of his passing, and we were inundated with the importance of housing and home ownership. But I found as I got older that was very unique to my family situation in a total Black community, as a whole. So I made it a part of my mission and work to be focused on home ownership, because that's where wealth building begins. That's where, the majority population built their wealth, is from home ownership and the access to it, and how we as a community were not provided access to that and find ourselves where we do now. So that's what brings me to this work. And I am so happy to be a part of this conversation again and share in this space. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you for being here, Nicole. And I promise we could talk forever about just that alone, passing on family legacies and building wealth. But for sake of time, we will continue. Donald King, can you please share what brought you here today?
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Nicole. Just as a little bit of background, I was a development partner with your late father, and he also brought me into the Seattle group of the Realtors. So I was a member of that organization as well. Our discussions today really touch on a number of the issues that are central in not only my professional life, but my personal life as well. It's a confluence of issues around not only home ownership, but also a decrease in that Black-white home ownership wealth gap, which is directly related to the wealth gap and that chasm of a gap between African Americans and white Americans. So I would certainly be remiss if I was not involved in this at some level, and I appreciate having the position and the honor of being on the plenary session this morning. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Donald, you have some slides that I would love for you to share now to help ground us in this conversation, and then we'll continue on with some questions for our panelists. Sound good?
Sure.
Thank you.
To really have a good understanding of how we got to where we are, we really need to take a look at the history of barriers to home ownership for what I call Africans in America. And I'm saying that as Africans in America because one, most of us have been on this continent before there was an America, since 1619. And the majority of that time, we were not considered full citizens of the United States once there was a United States. So that really began with the idea of dehumanization, that Africans and the lineage of Africans were not considered full human and therefore not deserving of full benefits of citizenship. Dehumanization, the first barrier. Theft. There's a history of celebrating the theft of land from indigenous people and Black people in this country. The art of the deal, the so-called purchase of Manhattan Island has been celebrated in at least a half dozen paintings and sculptures. The gun won the West, which in literal terms means if you have enough guns, you can take land. These are historic American folklore. Next slide. Next slide is disenfranchisement. The vote in America was originally limited to white land-owning men. This precedent influenced all laws and policies that followed. Next slide. Homestead. When the Homestead Act was passed in 1862, granting 160 acres of federal land to any US citizens, Africans in America were not US citizens and were excluded from the early land grabs of those 160 acres offered to whites only. Next slide. Reconstruction. Reconstruction, a great idea, not executed well, and pretty much not executed at all. Embedded within Reconstruction was the myth of 40 acres and a mule. It was really based on a special order issued by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman in January of 1865, following the end of the Civil War. President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor and sympathizer with the South, overturned that order in the fall of 1865, along with a multitude of Reconstruction initiatives that could have helped African Americans achieve status and privilege of citizenship and essentially land ownership and home ownership in the United States. All of that was undone between the months of January and the fall of 1865. The Great Migration. Black people created their own way out of the oppression of the South with the refugee movement out of the South to northern urban centers for a period of almost 100 years, beginning not long after the end of the Civil War, right up until the 1960s. African Americans made their home in northern urban centers, northeastern, and western, as well as the Northwest, became the home for Black people in this country. Urban often synonymous with being Black. That is changing. Next slide. The white response to Black people moving into urban centers during the Great Migration was to segregate the urban centers, was to make sure that Black people lived in only one part of that urban center, and to make sure that there were barriers presented and provided to prevent them from moving out of that, but also to prevent them from having full control over their neighborhood and over home ownership. Next slide. The tool to do that was redlining. Once you were able to segregate and define neighborhoods as Black neighborhoods, the Federal Home Loan Bank in the 1930s published a document on what was the most risk neighborhoods for loans. And actually, as law, illegal law, it was not within the Constitution to really deny African Americans access to mortgages, to home insurance in redlined areas, and actually prevent other banks and lending institutions from loaning to them, even if those banks and institutions wanted to. Redlining was not in the South. It's not considered a Jim Crow law. It took place in over 200 urban centers throughout the United States and was impactful right up until the 1960s. And the legacy still lives on in the inability for African Americans to build community in those neighborhoods. Once there was identified Black neighborhoods, Black cities, Black villages, violence was a response to those who were not obedient to white authority. Many prosperous Black communities like Tulsa's Greenwood District, also known as Black Wall Street, were destroyed. Rosewood, Florida, another one, many others. This terrorist response negatively influenced Black initiated financial independence. It put a chill on those that wanted to be independent financially, to be prosperous, to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Next slide. Veterans, all these smiling people here, looking at a bill being signed by President Roosevelt, the GI Bill, late 1940s. Black veterans in redlined communities were excluded from the GI benefits for home purchase. So here's another opportunity that was curtailed by the legacy and the compounding of barriers of redlining. Freeways. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 allowed for the planning of urban freeway construction as a tool to reinforce the physical barriers of segregated redline neighborhoods. So an additional barrier, a physical barrier, to one, define that neighborhood, to make sure that that neighborhood was less than in getting the infrastructure, home loans, and insurance necessary to reduce the wealth gap and homeownership gap. Next slide. Urban renewal, another tool. This tool was used to demolish so-called blighted, redlined neighborhoods that were unable to receive public infrastructure improvements and financing for home revitalization. Black communities were forced to relocate and rebuild, often within the city, but still destroying neighborhoods and communities. Next slide. Zoning. In response to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, cities like Seattle began to reinforce protections of single-family zones, primarily occupied by whites. Today, Seattle is zoned about 70% single-family. Again, reinforcing the idea of segregation, of limited access to loans and to home ownership. Taxes. It's the place we are right now. A record property tax spike is going on in Seattle. Today, property taxes rise as neighborhoods like Seattle Central District attracts more million-dollar homeowners, pushing out residents who paid much less for their homes, but are taxed on the neighborhood's current valuation. And unless you're impoverished, you don't get a tax break. But you may be someone like myself, who's not a millionaire, living in a neighborhood of millionaires. Yes, we can sell our home and make a profit, but we cannot move or buy in our neighborhood again. So home ownership is threatened by the idea of gentrification, rising home prices, and rising property taxes. So the compounding of all of these barriers has added to the loss, not just the opportunities for more Black homeownership, but actually the loss and the decline of Black homeownership right here in Martin Luther King County. Black homeowners and massive displacement of Black people who were forced out to migrate from the urban cities has happened across the United States. Today, affordable rental housing is prioritized as the public response and not home ownership. That has to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. King, for rooting us in the history, and as Barney her so eloquently put it, the generations of systemic racism that has brought us here today, and that we are all working hard to solve for. Nicole, can you go a little deeper in sharing with us the data of where we are today in home ownership, and Black home ownership in particular?
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Donald, for that history and really rooting us in the conversation that we're having. So, we have these numbers, these percentages of home ownership around different racial backgrounds and ethnicity. And so I want to give kind of a context from a state, county, and then I'll drill down into Seattle. So from a state perspective, Black homeownership, and these percentages are roughly between 2017 and 2020. So for the state, we see Black homeownership across the state at 34%. And then for Hispanic and Latino families, we see 44%. Then we see a really big jump between those two populations, and then the Asian community, which is at 62%, and the white community, which is at 66%. So we see almost a doubling from the Black community to the white community of homeownership in the state of Washington. Then we talk about King County, where the numbers get even more abysmal. Ironically, and maybe not ironically, the bulk of the Black community is focused in this I-5 corridor in the state of Washington. So from Pierce to King County and some in Snohomish, we find the majority, roughly 80% of the Black community is in this part of the state, but we're only 28% homeownership in the state, in King County. Hispanic Latinos, 34%, Asians drop down a little bit to 58%, and whites also see a small decline at 63%. So then let's talk about the city of Seattle. And from a city perspective, so some of the largest cities in the country, Seattle is number 3 for the worst homeownership for the Black community across the nation at 28%, exactly the number of the county. Hispanic and Latino see a slight rise from a county perspective of 37%, Asians are at 61%, and whites are at 65%. So, the white community sees a leveling, if you will, of home ownership. Doesn't move quite a bit, very much, as well as the Asian community. But when we talk about the Black and brown community, and specifically the Black community, we see major slides. And a lot of that is around the things that Donald talked about, the compounding systemic racist issues that are major barriers to home ownership to the Black community. We have some of these tropes, if you will, around Blacks not having the credit or the income. And the reality is most Black people are ready to buy and are that middle income. They have jobs, they have good credit, but we have these things that are pressing on them from the credit perspective. Most Black folks have student loan debt. I'm one of them. We have Darryl, one of them. We have this conversation. I'm still paying on my student loans. I try to set things in place so that my children, who you mentioned, 2 of them are in college, so they wouldn't have that issue. Couldn't do it. So now they have student loan barriers. And so we see this continuing escalation of issues where homeownership is becoming a huge mountain to climb. And then in our region specifically, we're talking about pricing and the capacity to be able to compete from having cash. Being in this market as a broker, I see it daily where my clients are being beat out by cash offers. They can't compete because I may have clients who together, a husband and wife, make really great money, $250,000 a year, but they don't have that historic legacy of having funding, right, from grandma or mom and dad who can take equity out of their home and say, hey, son or daughter, here's $100,000, here's $50,000 for your first home. We don't see that across the board here in the Black community because of those systemic issues that have been put in place that were very purposely pushed us down to where we could not be able to be a part of what we consider the American dream, if you will. And so we see these statistics just getting progressively worse as time goes on from the Black homeownership perspective.
Thank you, Nicole. Any either one of you, Darryl or Donald, want to add to that before I go to the next question?
Yeah, just a lot of head nodding there, Nicole. So much of what you said is straight on the truth. I too am paying a huge amount of student loans, and that aspect of that generational wealth not coming up to the generations is being part of the legacy and the problem that we face in terms of growing Black home ownership. Because, as Nicole very astutely puts it, there are tons of Black families that could be potential homeowners were it not for this legacy barrier that you almost have to carry around like an extra set of suitcases that you're dragging on your back. And it's a real problem.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nicole and Donald. I think we have the facts, we have the historical context, and now I want to talk about the personal connection. So, we all, especially in our community, have stories that connect us and tie us to this work. Darryl, I think I would love for you at this time to maybe share some personal reflection or story as to what grounds you in this work.
Well, so much of what Donald and Nicole talked about is true for just many, many thousands of Black families across the country. So here's, one story of a Black family, right? When my grandmother died in the Bronx, New York in the late 80s, one of the only documents that my mother found from her home was this behind me here. It's a little hard to see, but that is an original handwritten plat map and deed of ownership of land in Greenwood, South Carolina. My great-grandmother, Josie Stewart, who my mother is named for, my mom is Josie Smith, my great-great-grandmother owned 9 contiguous lots in the city of Greenwood, South Carolina. And on this plat map, there are the hand-scribbled family names on each of those lots. And at some point or another, this land was either lost or stolen or at least sold under value, and that generational wealth never came up through my family. Today, a white Baptist church sits on the Fannie Hurd and Sally Gilliam lots, exactly where my family owned it. I know this because when I was a broker for many years, I had access, and I called up and talked to the assessor in the county down in Greenwood and said, I want to see the title search of what happened. And they were only able to go back to about 1965. After that, the records don't exist. But somehow or another, that property, which is there today, is not owned by my family. And so my great-grandmother, as a Black woman in 1921, was able to own something, right? But that legacy never passed to my grandmother, my mother, and to me. And so if I'm fortunate enough to be able to have great grandkids, my daughter's 21, now out of college, living in LA, working a great job, super proud of her, of course. She'll always have this document in her home as a reminder of what happened to our family. And she'll never have that ongoing legacy because we will provide for her one way or another so that she will have home ownership and then pass that to her children and hopefully her grandchildren. This story is repeated for thousands upon thousands of Black families in America. There may be some family story. Maybe you're lucky enough to have a document like we do. So we've got a bit of a story and a document, but we don't have that generational wealth. And so Josie Stewart, who was a Black woman in 1921, was able to own something, could not pass that legacy on to her heirs. Something happened. And that story of one family and what we've been through is really the sort of the germination. It's that hard nut that you kind of carry around, something like under your skin that's sort of always there as a reminder that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. This is a problem that needs to be addressed. And so in my work as ED of HomeSight, we are very motivated to play our role in increasing mortgage lending for middle-income families, for low and moderate income families, for BIPOC families, but especially for African-American families. And I like to be really specific about that because that's where the numbers that Nicole talked about, the history that Donald laid out for all of us is the motivating factor to correct this ill. There was direct policy that caused this, and it's our role and all we do on this call, frankly, to reverse this and truly to create a just society. So I'll talk about it in a panel later on, but we have a new product called the Social Justice Purchase Assistance Loan, which is specifically motivated by and developed for the African-American community for down payment assistance, interest rate buy down, and closing cost. So as Nicole talked about, how do we make purchasers more competitive in a really high cost market like Seattle? These are some of the tools we need to bring to bear to make this happen.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for setting the stage for the work that we'll continue to do today and really throughout our lives. I want to just mention that those of you that are joining us, if you have a question for our panelists, although we may not be able to answer it during this plenary, when we do our breakout sessions, our panelists may be able to address it. So please share those in the chat if you have any questions. We have about 5 minutes left, and what I would love for us to touch on now are the work. I know, Darryl, you mentioned some of it, but the work that you all are doing to address that challenge statement that Carla mentioned earlier and how we're going to get there. Now let's talk about solutions. We set the stage on we know the historical context, we know the facts, and we know how we got here. But now what are we doing to solve for this? Well, how are we going to get to that 60,000 homeowners by 2041 or sooner? Before 2041, I'll say. Nicole, let's start with you.
So in my work in the brokerage specifically, I'm really focusing on bringing folks to the table to, one, educate, because one of the big barriers we see is that we've been fed a story for so long, and I mean in the Black community, that what we are not able to do and what we can't do. We see it in the media, we see it in history, we see it in law, we see it in absolutely everything that is just an affront to who we are as a people and trying to grow our legacy. So I'm really working to dismantle those framings that were made for us but not by us, and doesn't reflect who we are as people, and really touch the community around home ownership, because that's where I want to focus. And I think that in that work, what I do is working with clients who, one, getting them prepared for home ownership, educating them, because it's not just about getting your home, it's about getting your home and keeping your home. As we saw from the Great Recession, again, the Black community home ownership rate has started to creep up, and then it got decimated because they were targeted firmly by the subprime lending practices of a lot of the financial institutions who preyed on those inner city communities who, one, have been starved for lending for decades. Let's really give it a framework. My grandparents, we owned our home in our family in the Central District since 1921. When my third great uncle came here in World War I, he moved my entire family here from Mississippi on my mom's side. And we owned our home from that time on until there were situations that were out of our control. I wasn't old enough to be a part of that process, where we are no longer owning in the Central District. My entire family lived there, and now we don't. So getting back to home ownership is what's really important, and learning that you can start at a condo or a townhouse or what have you. Education is key. And so I am just one buyer at a time, one family at a time, helping to build that home ownership gap. And through my work in the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, we are really trying to frame this work from a statewide perspective, really getting education around advocacy, policy, working, because that's where it starts, really. It starts on the state and the local and the county and the city, because that's where the laws were. It was written, Black people can't live here. I was an underwriter for 15 years and saw these titles in my files that I was underwriting where it had these old title, these easements where they were all white communities. Black folks couldn't live there, Indigenous folks couldn't live there. So this is very, very real. This is very much in my time seeing this work. And so it is important that we focus on growing that home ownership and growing those numbers so that we can start to build that equity and that wealth. And that's where I'm starting from my role with the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, NARAB, my broker work, and with U.S. Bank. U.S. Bank has made a huge commitment to the Black community nationwide, and I'm using that work here locally to really help to integrate services, because it's so widespread. We'll be here all day, but we're working to really be supportive in every way we can from a financial perspective. So I believe if where you come from, you can bring some help to that conversation and work in your specificity and where your treasures lie. We are able to really work on this here in Seattle. So that's the work that I'm doing in the 3 roles that I serve in currently to really help navigate this huge problem, but be a part of the solution, along with, these wonderful gentlemen on this panel, you, Michelle, we work in close contact, and, others, with Marty bringing this convening together. It's very important that we make this a communal effort to ensure that we get this done.
Yeah. Darryl, I want to switch the question for you. Thank you, Nicole, for that. I want to switch the question for you just slightly, because you already shared what just a fraction of the work that HomeSight is doing, and you're doing so much more. What's your challenge to those that are watching today to get involved in solving for this issue?
Well, that's a great question, Michelle. And I was just thinking about that because an old friend, Haywood Watson, put something in the chat of how do we share, how do we do this work together? Yeah. And I think we need more of that kind of partnership. I'm really honored and happy to partner with Nicole and NAREB as a formal partner with HomeSight to really spread the word and educate and use these products and let the community know that we have, the ability to help you to really achieve this dream. That is so needed in the community. So I think we need to see a lot more partnership with many of the folks that are representing different organizations, whether they're lenders or builders that are on this call. I think there's 115 folks involved. We ought to have some new partnerships that come out of this convening today so that we can address this issue. I don't think that any organization by itself has, frankly, a big enough footprint to do it alone. We need big time lenders to work with community development corporations and community development financial institutions like HomeSight to partner and really develop some new products and some new strategies. Frankly, we need to really look at new strategies, and that's what comes out of these kinds of conversations and partnerships to address these challenges.
Thank you. And Donald, share with us, you have the last word, but I know that Naima Initiative is doing some amazing work that I want to make sure that those of us that are in the audience today know about and how we can uplift that work.
Yeah, I can probably lead with 3 phrases, three words that the Nehemiah Initiative is focused on. One is retention, and that really begins with the retention of historic Black home ownership, but also Black land, Black property. So if we don't retain what we have, acquiring more is going to be even more difficult. So let's retain what we have, particularly the Black church land, Black institutional land. Second is innovation. How are we more innovative in how we use property, how we fund projects, and how we engage and include people in the development and funding of projects, including more shared equity in property and innovation in home ownership. The last being the idea of how do we advocate for policies, laws, changes that are our current barriers, you know, that we will look back on 10, 20 years from now and say, why did we allow that to happen? Well, it's happening right now. Why are we allowing it to happen? Why are we allowing for Black seniors to lose their homes because they're living in a neighborhood of millionaires and taxed as a millionaire? Why is there not justice in that way? And why is there not justice, including reparations for the damage and the harm that has been done through all of those barriers that I just listed? All of those barriers were illegal. They were unconstitutional. Who's going to be held accountable for the harm that's done and the legacy of the harm?
Absolutely. First, I want to thank you all for sharing your time with us today, your knowledge and your brilliance. I think there's definitely some common themes that we can take with us today, for sure. That policies that got us here, it's going to be policies that get us out of here and on a pathway to building wealth and home ownership for our community. That there's some brilliance in our community that needs to be uplifted and shared. And I thank you all for leading this initiative, for diving right in and putting your brilliance and effort towards you guys have always been doing this work, and I'm glad you are leading this effort while we are all leaning in on how to change outcomes for Black families and people of color. We don't have enough time to continue this conversation. I hope that we can, are able to meet again and keep going. We will dig deeper into the work during our breakout sessions. And again, thank you to Marty, to Carla, all the partners that are a part of this work. And I'm looking forward to continue the conversation. And with that, it has been my pleasure to serve as your moderator, and I will hand it back to Marty as we go into the breakout session.